I don't have any like really good introduction stuff that I thought of.
No,
That was I suck at intros.
same here. Um, but you and I, we like talking bolt action, so that's good enough. Doesn't matter if we can't think of
It's true.
anything for an intro. It's
That's
Jacob
true.
here, HMG episode. Got Dan on the phone with me now,
Hello.
and yeah, we've been hanging out together a little bit more at a couple of events. Perth
Yeah.
is still very strong with all kinds of bolt action events coming up. Next
hmm
one should be Spartan in, I think that's this weekend or next
It's
weekend.
this weekend. Yep,
Yep.
this
Yep.
weekend, 2nd of July. So it's a much more competitively driven than what we've done in Perth historically, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So again, more variety, more stuff in our community to take part of, and that's actually the initial concepts were put together by Matt Castles and Liam, and then Gorchin's running that one on the day, and we've got that
Very
at
cool.
also another location for us. Good Games Cannington has picked that one up for us to run. So, or not for us to run, for them to run.
Mhm.
But look, it's another event, and I'm
Yep.
looking forward to see where that grows and how it goes. And with the name of Spartan, you'd expect there to be a little focus on certain types of other things, and we'll probably end up with, I suspect, a few more in that in that category as we move forward.
Yeah, fantastic. And then the other one that I'm keeping an eye on, this is a bit of a private event that happens typically every year. I think it's around Jackson's birthday. I'm not quite sure, but I have missed the last two, and that is he does a Budapest themed
Yep.
um, battle day, which is 6 to 8 players per side on a massive board, and it's all using theatre lists from Siege of Budapest, Fortress Budapest book.
Yep.
So I'll be at that one in a couple of weeks, and I'll cover what I can from there. It's going to be a crazy day.
Mm, it's gonna be
Um,
an awesome day.
and then you and I just came fresh off an event as well.
Yes, so we, within the last, oh, might have actually been almost 3 weeks now,
Yep.
we were at a part of the Objective Secured charity event that they did, where they hosted several different systems, and it was all about raising money for our some of our local charities that OBSEX is normally connected with. And so I think in this one was there was a young men's uh, mental health charity that was
Yep.
being supported through them, and so I was asked, "Hey, do you want to come along and run something and try and generate some money for charity?" And I was like, "Hey, that sounds like a great idea, but I'm going to do it very differently because we'd done charity events before, and because there was a lot of other events that were coming up on the pad, I
Mm-hmm.
didn't want to just run another stock standard event. I went, let's do something a little bit different. We've got some freedom of license here, and it's for a good cause, just raising money for charity." And so I created Motor Mayhem. Now, Motor Mayhem, there are things that we learnt that we'd do differently next time, but essentially we had three 6x4 tables that were connected on the long edges to make one massive board. And it was chock full of terrain and all sorts of stuff. And through one of our previous, I guess, connections that we've had, we were able to support virtually every armored vehicle that any
Mm-hmm.
player would need for the event. So it was
Yeah.
literally a case of
Yeah.
you can just bring the money you want to donate. You don't have to bring terrain. You don't have to bring tables.
Think of the physical number of tanks that were in the war. That's how many we had.
Maybe not that many, um, but we did have we did have some stuff there from uh, which came about, and I've been able to provide a lot of models that people were able to use, and so it was a case of pick whatever you want, like
Mhm.
anything that's on that table, just grab one of those and we'll play. We did a race, uh, we tried to do a free for all at the end, but we'd actually run out
Mhm.
of time really for that to get going. And then we actually did a convoy
Convoy
chase,
mission.
which
That was great.
that was a very different sort of mission. So these were not player versus player. This was more team versus team.
Mhm.
But you could backstab, you could do all sorts of things. And I had a whole mechanic that was built around if you donate X dollars for whatever, however much you want to go up to, that can give you a certain number of effects. And we had
Yep.
people that were quite liberally on certain things, just going, "I'm just going to drop $10 here or whatever to make
Mhm.
sure that this shot is going to create problems and go through armor and stuff." We had people that were like, we had prototype tanks, a mouse tank, if we had fake tanks, we had all sorts of things that you just don't see in normal games, and sometimes it's for very good reasons. But I created a platform where it was like, bring whatever,
the models you own.
It really doesn't matter. It's like if you have a land battleship from World War One that you want to bring it, just throw it down on the table. Don't be upset when you're destroyed, because everyone's going to be firing anti-tank shells. So, but it was a great day.
Yeah. So to clarify, this was a vehicle event.
A vehicle only event.
Yeah, we've kind of talked about like a Mario Kart kind of thing before. And I mean, we split this over a couple of different missions. First one was just a race to the end of the board. Everybody had one tank. You didn't matter which type that you picked.
Vehicle.
Yeah, one vehicle. It could be an armored car. It could be a transport. It could be a Sturm Tiger. It's whatever you wanted it to be. And then all the manipulations for the charity would boost that. So, you're taking a shot, you can up its penetration by 1 by spending $1, and then the opposing player can counter by upping his armor by 1 by paying $1 and all that kind of stuff. So it's all in good fun. I'm just trying to think the winner of the race that we first
That was Chris.
Played. Yeah,
that was Chris. So Chris, who was actually somebody who lived sort of in the area and happened to just drop by, and he was like, I don't think I can necessarily stay that long. And I was like, well, look, you're more than welcome to grab a vehicle and throw it on the table. And I think he grabbed an armored car on the basis that he thought he was going to get like just one shot and it'd be nice and quick. He ended up coming back going, hey, it turns out I can stay a little bit longer. So he stayed for pretty much the whole first game. And he just ran the car up the side, and we had opportunity to take him out. We didn't convert. It wasn't helped by the fact that there was a lot of backstabbing on the start line.
I did not provide any opportunity to fire at this target until turn 12 or whatever, right at the end, because
and he was way gone by that point.
It was just more hilarious to be shooting up other tanks in their spawn points.
It was.
And some wacky things, Sturm Tigers, flame half tracks, all that kind of stuff. Things that you just don't typically use. It was a lot of fun. But Convoy's where it got serious.
Yes.
And it's a lot more strategic. Same exact board. And this is a combination of several, I guess, game boards that we've used in the past. Just because it's just so massive, it just is a combination of terrain from all over in your collection.
Well, and I wanted tank ranges of their guns to actually matter as well. And so when I put it together, it was a mix of tank war as a like the tank battle scenario. It was a mix of that, a mix of probably like double envelopment, where it's like trying to run things off the board edges. And a simple mix of a free-for-all tank battle. It was a really odd sort of idea, because the transport convoys that were brought onto the table, you either had to protect or destroy them, and they were controlled by the umpire, which was me. And so with the model collection that we had something like 40 transports that at any given moment were going to come onto the board, and they were going to run off. And so for every transport that escapes, it was certain number of victory points. For everyone that was destroyed, it was a certain number of victory points. And then for each armored fighting vehicle that was killed on each side, you then got points for that as well. And it very quickly became apparent that the way to stop an armored convoy is to physically block the road, because they can't move as fast. Which created, because as soon as if the road wasn't blocked, due to the scenario and what I was trying to do and the speed at which I was trying to run things, that convoy, they were always going to run, and they got infinite number of pivots provided they stayed on a road, which meant that they were stupid fast, way faster than what you'd normally allow in a bolt action game. But it put the pressure on the players, which is what it was there for.
So we did an even split of players from attacker defender, basically. They got their own choice of out of the tank collection. And that was typically 3 or 4 Zugs per player, so like a group of about 3 tanks, and maybe about 3 of them, probably about 12 order dice apiece per player, something like that.
Yeah, that's around that.
And we simplified the activations as well.
Correct. I
Yeah.
just simply did it as each player can take one order per essentially per tank that they had, or sorry, per platoon of tanks that they had. They only can control one platoon at a time. So they talk about things like that in the back of the rulebook as to how to simplify some of those order systems. But I was like, I need to hit the objective of I want you to have more than one tank available per player, but I want those still to be able to play relatively quickly. So all up, we were still probably only playing with maybe about 30-40 dice, somewhere in that space at any given moment. But most of it was actually closer to sort of the 20, sort of 10 tank society either way. But the benefit is everyone had an absolute ball because none of them
100%.
had played a mission like that at all, and certainly not on a table that big.
Yeah, and really even being able to enjoy armor to that extent. Typically, you've got one armored vehicle in a list. If you take it, people have opinions on if that's effective or not. And then, does it get its points back? Does it actually do anything spectacular? Does it end up just,
Does it need to?
Yeah. But like, there are so many cool vehicles in this game, and that's where we really got to play around with them. And yeah, it was a nice simplified mechanic. We got to move basically three armored vehicles at a time. Then the next player would do his, and back and forth, and blah blah blah. And it was. It was good, but it was at a point where we just had to start shoving German tanks onto the main road to prevent the convoys from moving on. They all slipped through. That one was really good. That's
and the points, the actual points, the victory points were tied basically right up until the end. You guys were neck and neck on both sides trying to attack and defend it. So it was I will do something more like that because it was good. What it did get me to, of course, when I was trying to think about that mission and transports and how I was going to handle it, is I did have to start thinking about transports in the game, and I knew that I was going to stretch them beyond their capabilities for the mission, but I had to understand what their capabilities were. And we thought it would be a good moment to sit down and just talk about transports in a bit more detail, especially for example, our newer players that are coming onto the scene. We've talked tangentially before on the podcast about transports, how new players are they either buy in completely and they go with something, or they completely avoid them because they're not sure how to use them or how relevant they are. And so we'll talk about a couple of things briefly that we've talked about before and sort of hit the high points. But then we'll get into a few other discussions and some of the rules that affect transports. The other component, which I forgot to mention in the briefing notes, Jacob, is Bo Mortensen does a fantastic video on transport vehicles. So he would absolutely be a channel to go check out for some additional info, and definitely at a rules and strategy point of view, with some great explanations and drawings.
That particular transport video that he has is in a little classroom. He's drawn a little map of how to use them, whatever else. I like to watch that before an event. It gives me a refresher on how I can use them effectively. I've been shoving transports in every single list that I have for probably the last 6 months. We'll go into some ways to use them. I'm still kind of on stage 1, but we will get there, and one day I'll learn to adapt. And but I'm actually quite comfortable with how I'm using them at the moment.
Good.
So Bo is the man that you want to check for all things bolt action competitive. Great place to learn from. But you're here with us, so why don't we go through it ourselves?
So I think the first part really is, and we're going to take a given that you are already considering putting something in your list as a transport, as the first, because otherwise you're not going to have this conversation, right? So we're thinking that you're going to have at least one transport in your list, and you're now trying to understand, how do I use that transport? What's the purpose? Or do I just put it down and see what happens? All valid options. Your first real hurdle is in deployment and understanding what you need to do with that transport in deployment. This is pretty clearly tied to what you want that transport to do during the game, and that's mission dependent, but also opponent and their build dependent. You might see an opponent unit where you go, I have to hunt that down, and I just have to. This unit is going to have to go in that truck or that half track, and we're just going to have to go toe to toe and provide a challenge. You might have an anti-tank team or a flamethrower team. You might be doing something really weird, like I was with light mortars in transports, and using that to try and push up the board, and then immediately start trying to cause suppression with my Japanese. But most of the time, it's going to come down to: are you trying to do something in the first 2 turns of the game, in turn 1 or turn 2, which I typically, in my head, that makes sense as like a rush, where you're trying to push those transports as far forward as possible, even at the sacrifice of not being in cover, and disgorge its troops. Or are you trying to hang around in cover a little bit longer because you want to be able to strike back in a turn 3, turn 4 space once the game has developed a little bit, and then you commit them, almost as if they're like a reserve that you're going to hold on to. There's obviously a couple of different subtleties on both of those major themes, but most uses that I've seen align to one of those two pushes.
Yep.
And the exception is putting them in outflank from reserve, which you can either have them in reserve as a defense, or put them in outflank as an attack on the side. So I think I know you've certainly seen me do the turn 1, turn 2 rush attacks with transports on people, and I know you were trying it early in your bolt action career, and you didn't quite have a handle on how it was working, and so it led to some bad results.
I wasn't particularly happy to begin with. I mean, I think there's a purpose that I was lacking. There was early me that half tracks are what a part of the German army. They look cool, blah blah blah, and I want to use them. They're quite expensive, and the purpose of moving the troops up is for them to do something. Regular riflemen, it doesn't really matter if they're at long range or not. So typically, I am using transports for the rush with engineers.
Yep.
And because I play German, I'm starved for points as it is. So I'm always going for inexperienced transport with the lowest man capacity to get the smallest amount of points to get my engineers up the board and cause a threat immediately. And I've had success with this, but particularly this works for me because it, how do I put this? It takes advantage of bad placement on the opposing side with their deployment. So that's been typically my successes have been somebody has made a mistake and there is something for me to breach and I can do it quickly.
Yes.
And I only found this to work with. So a rush tactic needs to have multiple transports that are doing the same thing.
Yeah. That's one of the, I guess what I understand is one of the pinnacles of to make a successful rush attack like that is you, and even I'd almost say that even 2 isn't quite enough, depending on how many troops are being dropped. If you're only dropping sort of 5-man units, then 2 is definitely not enough, because your infantry, when they get there, won't make it. Go ahead.
My successes with it relate to an overall threat across the board in multiple places at the same time. So my standard list is 2 NG squads in the trucks that are the cheapest. They're called heavy field cars for Germans. They're like the 30 points or something like that. And I also like to flout a Shrek squad in a Kubel. And I like to take away from the armored car, the tank slot, and start using some light auto vehicles and that kind of stuff. So I'd already in my head, I'm like, the Shrek's good enough for anti-tank capability. Troops have all got Faust and all that kind of stuff. Everything's running with ARs as it is. So there's threats everywhere. So they can't deal with all of them.
That's right.
And that can be a bit of a trap for people. And I feel most comfortable that way. And I think that I can adapt with it quite well depending on the terrain as well, because it's either this is coming at you and deal with it, or this is quite well up the board and hidden. It's one of the two.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, it's similar to what my experiences are in that space. I am I am not hesitant of throwing a transport out to die.
Yep.
You know, because that's one of the other ways of using those transports is like I'm going to deliberately try and leapfrog the unit out.
Yeah.
You know, even if you hit and kill the transport, okay, worst case scenario, I'm going to lose 6 guys, but that's pretty unlikely.
Yeah.
You know, I might lose 3 or 4. That's not fantastic. Depending on the size of my squads, that obviously changes how I play. But for example, if I was running forward with one of my Japanese carriers, which can carry 13 Japanese riflemen, I don't care how many you kill, because I'm fanatic anyway. And so those big rushes out into the board, you know, and it's simply taking ground. And we'll get to impacts of what it does later on. But the rush in turn 1, turn 2 is it's probably also what I see newer players getting wrong the earliest and the quickest. Is they either rush to the wrong point on the battlefield, or they time the rush wrong, and so they can get shot up before they've actually dropped the threat on the board. So
in particular with turn 1 and 2, where I find that this is easier is because you have all of your order dice for the most part, depending on the deployment, the mission, blah blah blah. But as soon as it becomes crucial for a transport in later turns to do what it needs to do, usually down, and you never quite get to, you can get lucky, whatever, but I find it much more difficult to rely on that to do its job at that key point in the game. So I like to use it early.
Yeah, and I often find, you know, as we transition into that second component of turn 3, turn 4, I often find that when I'm using that approach is because I'm either playing defensively for the mission, so I know that I'm outnumbered or I know that I'm outgunned, and so I need to be maybe a little bit more hesitant to, and I don't want to overextend, or it's simply a case of I know what I want to hit and where, but I just don't know where that is right now on turn 1 and turn 2. It might be in reserves, it might be an outflank, and so for me to actually react to it, you know, I have to hold position. And there's costs with doing that in the game. Like, the more that you are holding back a unit in a transport for multiple turns, that unit's obviously not shooting, it's obviously not putting pressure on objectives or holding ground anywhere, it's not throwing out any sort of pin suppression, maybe not even from the vehicle MGs if you're really hidden. You know, it also means, you know, if something like a artillery observer on bombardment gets placed near you, it's like, I don't want to commit my transport somewhere, but I have to move it. Otherwise, I'm potentially going to get hit. So then you're forced out of position by waiting that little bit longer. The difference, of course, is it is very hard to, once you've already committed to an assault and I don't mean assault as a close combat, I simply mean your unit's moving forward on an objective. It's very hard once you've committed certain actions towards that to then be able to beat back a fully fresh reserved unit from a truck or a you know, a half track. That the half track rolls up, it takes shots at you, then the guys get out and they take shots at you, and often after that, you know, even that small interchange, which isn't a point sufficient one, but if it's timed right, that can actually just stop your assault, and it just stops you pushing forward on that flank. So it's, when they're timed well, they can actually be extremely effective, and just shut down an option. It's something which takes, again, similar to the turn 1, turn 2, there is a timing element of getting that right, which I think really applies to transports in general. You know, that if you execute them at the right time, they're very beneficial. And if you make a mistake, they can get punished very easily. I've several of the trucks that I've sent forward at the wrong time that have ended up as burning craters, and I've got no return. The units inside have died and folded, and or been like ranged in on after they went down, and it's just like that unit's essentially wasted, and the truck was wasted doing it. And then there's sort of the I know, right? It's like that's a similar story for a lot of people. And look, all the players that it's happened to that I could bring up, it's like they're wonderful players. I don't hold anything against them for it. And then we've got the sort of the in-between option, which is maybe I'll I'll just adapt a little bit and I'll be in cover, but I want to move forward. So that's sort of, you're taking ground, but you're not really trying to be too aggressive with it because you're wanting to wait for that opportunity, and you don't actually know whether it's turns 2, 3, 4, or 5 or whatever. Typically, you find that in something like point defense, when you're on defense against those 3 points and you're wanting to see where the main push of the enemy is coming to. So you can't plan for it, for example, on a turn 3, 4. You have to see what's going to happen. And then, and this is probably a question that I'd ask you to see whether your position might have changed or not. But what about putting things in reserve or outflank? Reserve being more of a defensive move rather than outflank up the side. What do you think of doing that?
This is where I fail with all of it. I mean, I'm my head's going to the spot of outflank, and I think that for me personally, it's just way too risky because you're determining a path on either left or right, blah blah blah, and that's completely changed at the point that you're going to use it. And do you have the right dice and all that to make it work, or are you just going to get your transport shot up right there? But you're talking specifically from just reserve from your side of the board.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
So certainly that first example with outflank is the typical one that that most, I say most people, but it's when you realize how you can use a transport, most people then go, I'm going to put transports in outflank because it's clearly the right thing to do. But of course, it's a whole different set of timings, and so they get caught out of position. They go, it's useless. Or I lost 3 turns waiting for outflank, and then because I chose the wrong side of the board, nothing happened when they came on. Things happen, but not at the extent required to actually impact the game significantly and change the result. A little bit of persistence, you can turn that around, and a little bit of forward planning on what you want your units to do, you can change that. But coming on from reserve in defense is a very different move. It's not one you really see a lot in, I guess, our competitive meta or casual play meta, mainly because the missions we play encourage you to maneuver forward. We don't have we typically don't play a lot of attack and defender setups that would require you.
However, it is fantastic on defender when you're doing that. So the clear example that some of the people in our community know is Mike, and he uses that land carrier garbage that can do like 30 dudes in it or whatever it is.
It's not garbage.
Well, it's amazing, but yeah, I mean, it's think of the insane transport capacity vehicles. These are actually really good for because you effectively are defending any point on the battlefield,
and strongly. You're defending it very strongly.
They can't get hit until it comes on. I've witnessed it twice, and it's quite deadly.
Yeah, and I think that's there's a few points that I've got later on that we will talk about that similar example. But you're not wrong. And I think even once you get those deployment elements down of where you put it, trying to use terrain, whether you go in reserve, whether you go in outflank, are you planning to move up on turn 3, turn 4, turn 1, turn 2, that rush? A lot of that obviously depends on the mission. It depends on the terrain, and it depends on what your opponent is bringing. Obviously, if they're packed to the gills with anti-tank weaponry or flamers or things like that, potentially getting close early is not what you want to do because you're just gifting them more opportunity to take you out. But vice versa, if they're basically packing nothing but riflemen and you've got half tracks for whatever reason you've taken them. Sure, you might take some pins, but you're not actually going to take any damage. And so, pushing them forward and getting them pinned is inconvenient, but it's actually not detrimental.
The most common transport tactic I've seen, which I just think that every player kind of defaults to at some point, is the outflank with an engineer squad in one truck.
Yes.
And this is designed for things that are like demolition or whatever else. Missions where you need to capture something in the backfield.
In the backfield,
So, I don't fault that. It kind of seems almost like a default most of the time. A lot of people do play it.
But at the same time, your opponent's got to react to that. So they, knowing that that's in the list, they've now got to reserve something to counter it.
Yes.
Or they ignore it entirely.
Or they ignore it.
But it's one of the two, and now they need to make a decision before you even play, for the most part.
Correct. And that's where some of these deployment choices, they have different pros and cons. Certainly with outflank, you have your opponent not only thinking, okay, I need to keep something back in reserve, or at least on the back towards the board edge that's strong enough to handle that unit.
Mm-hmm.
You've also got them guessing now which side, as at the outpost, at the output of, once you've made your decisions, it's like, right, so now I know how I'm going to deal with it. Oh, but I still don't know which side of the board they're coming in on. So how am I? Okay, all right. And it's those sorts of things that simply through experience and playing lots of games, you'll learn what becomes natural to you.
Mm-hmm.
I would also say that if you do enjoy using outflank, try really hard to shake it up every now and then and not constantly choose the one side, because players will learn your behavior.
Mm-hmm.
It happened to me in a game, which I didn't connect that this is what happened for a little while, but against this one individual, I typically would put something in outflank and come on from the same side almost every game. And it didn't matter what setup. It was just that's how I was playing against them. And so when we went to play, it was just like, so you're putting it in outflank. It's like, okay. And he loaded up the flank that I just wrote down, and I was like, in his first turn, he's sort of known where I'm going to come on from. I'm sort of committed now. And from his point of view, it was still 50-50 in terms of, mission variables and terrain and everything like that. But he's like, but out of a 50-50, every game you've played at me, you've come in on the right side. So I just took a punt that's where you were coming in. And I did.
Yeah.
and it's sort of just like, I've only ever used the right-hand side when outflanking with this guy,
Mm-hmm.
and I've used a similar sweeping motion with how the army then comes together to try and pressure it. And so he just went, I'm just going to break that this time.
Mm-hmm. And look, the real clever player will see how you're deploying the rest of your force. Try and judge. Of course, you could feign it and all that kind of stuff, but sometimes it's not worth the risk.
Yeah. No, that's very, very true. And I guess when we come to starting to talk about, the risks and the impacts of your transports, and before we get into, I guess, some of the other specifics on transports that are examples that we want to talk about, transports have some quirky rules in how passengers interact with them, what happens when they get shot at, when inexperienced transports versus veteran transports, and why you see one over the other. So it's, I know we got it's page 114, I think you mentioned earlier, that is the transport page. So I would recommend
it goes for a little while.
It goes for a little while, yeah. I would recommend if you're looking to try and understand how to use a transport, read the book, because there is actually a lot that goes in and out.
Honestly, highlight this section. It becomes a question at every single event. Just
even if you know the answer.
Rules. It can be quite useful. In particular about just what happens to passengers that are getting damaged when they disembark and do combat and all that kind of stuff. That's just going to be useful to have on hand. Some of the basic stuff, like if you embark on a transport, it can't move that turn. You can only disembark if it's advanced. If you run it, you can't get out. That kind of stuff. So those are the key things of this is what a transport is. And then when it gets pinned, the troops take pins. So it's a bit of a risk.
And that's something which that has a flow-on effect to when you then go to fire. So pins on the vehicle and the vehicle firing, that's obvious. Okay, yes, we're taking negatives. That's just what's going to happen. Pins on a unit inside a vehicle, even though that unit, I guess, abstractly is firing additional weapons, that has no impact at all. And so you could have a unit of 10 riflemen inside a transport. The transport may have managed to clear its pin, for example, so it would be firing on net 0 from its pins, even though the unit inside, who is actually firing those machine guns, has the one pin. It's things like that where it's just like they are still two separate units. Definitely understanding the timing and the order on what happens when a transport vehicle is assaulted with something inside. Read that section a couple of times. It's quite it's not a detailed procedure, but it's a very odd procedure. And then when you think you understand that, then go look at the FAQ when it talks about units jumping out and getting into cover, because that was one of the loopholes that was around. Is like, we'll talk about the procedure essentially. So you do everything you would as normal for charging a unit. If the transport is found in range and it has a unit inside, that unit gets out to fight. Now, it actually doesn't say how they get out, and so that was simply, it's just get out within 6 inches. That's it. You get out, and then the attackers magically teleport to your unit to then fight that unit. Now, you could then put them into cover, which is where this FAQ question came
away,
from.
all that kind
or
of
further
stuff.
away, or push them back, or push them forward. You could essentially use it to try and pull them out of position and have them charge further than the 12 inches they're legally allowed to, so that you get extra shots onto them, all that sort of stuff. And a lot of those things are actually valid. Most people don't bother because they just play the thematic thing of, well, it goes out in front of the truck, obviously, or the half track or whatever. But you actually can put them within 6 inches of anywhere. So you can put them 6 inches behind as they're running away, and the chargers magically teleport to them and potentially slaughter them or get slaughtered, however it works out. And then they consolidate D6 inches backwards. It's really odd. But it does give you that ability to potentially save the transport. It's a bit weird. But even if you put them in cover, like the FAQ says, it's not simultaneous. You don't gain any benefit for that. You were charged coming out of a transport. And you never actually, unless the transport was empty, you never actually strike at the transport. Which is something else like, but I charged the transport. Yeah, but it doesn't matter. it's just
but this is happening.
It doesn't matter. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a bit quirky.
What about what happens if the transport's actually destroyed? Like, I mean, we know the answer, but for new players.
So this one's a little bit funky because it becomes a ruin. And it has a higher cover capacity than what it had initially, being a soft skin vehicle if you had troops behind it. This becomes pretty cheeky later on. So when you have a lot of transports, what you can do, Bo calls it castling.
Yes.
So it's effectively you've got an objective that you're trying to hold with an infantry unit. You've got transports that have done its duty. You're on turn 4, 5, 6, whatever. You start parking them up and you start using them as cover, in the hope that they actually shoot them and you have better cover.
Yeah. Only for soft skin vehicles, because for armored vehicles it's actually irrelevant. It's exactly the same. Yeah. But it is absolutely a bonus that a soft skin vehicle can give you that an armored vehicle can't, even on death. The first time because Bo, when I watched Bo's videos, when I clued in on that, I was like, oh.
Let me read the book.
I was like, how did I miss that? So when your vehicles are destroyed, and it's actually any vehicle, not just transport vehicles, but when any vehicle is destroyed, it is left in place as a wreck, specifically an impassable wreck. That will grant cover attributed to its status. So soft skins normally become from a -1 soft skin vehicle, then become essentially a piece of hardcover rubble or something like that. So it's most of the time it's like you got to try and avoid shooting through it anyway, because you're now wanting to avoid giving them that cover. But where it does matter, you are getting a slight benefit. Which, when they're nice and cheap, it's and you have a lot of them, it's quite good.
Yeah, and particularly if you've rushed an objective and you have dudes in it, people are trying to shoot the transport to kill it. Now it's cover for you, and you got your guys going out to the objective, and it's all fine.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah,
there's a couple of sorry.
I was going to say that, like, the tricky thing to do with transports is after they've done their job, what do they do? So yeah, that's obviously an easy tactic that you don't really have to put too much thought into. I mean, the best method would be to find them another purpose, to find them more people to transport.
Yep.
And then the lazy way is to just chuck them back in your deployment so they don't get killed and the opponent doesn't get an order dice.
Yep, out of sight and just keep them safe. For a long time, that's all I ever thought I could do with them once they drop their troops off, is just because I never normally give my trucks guns. I could, but I'm just like, for me, I'm like, if I give the truck a gun, it's like I'm trying to suddenly make that more aggressive unit, and I'll start using them differently. And I'm quite efficient at just using them as transports, and I don't really want to. Don't fiddle with what's not broken, essentially. I was like, I can use transports well. I'm just going to draw the line. I'm just going to stop. But I do think that like there's a few other interactions with transports that you might, as a new player, immediately come across and have thoughts about. And one of them is like, well, how does snap to action work? And the reality is, you can, providing the officer is outside the transport, you can snap to action the transport itself, but you can't do anything to the unit inside. And same as the transport can still use the morale bonus of a officer who is inside or outside, but you can't the unit inside then can't use the morale bonus of or the snap to. And so there's a few quirks that go back and forth like that. What can actually get in the transport is actually a little bit, it's simple but mind-bending at the same time because of the way unit categorization works. So for units, you have infantry, and you have artillery, and you have vehicles as your three distinct unit types.
Categories.
Yep. Artillery, when they mount up, they are towed, and so they have their own sort of quick rules of summary of how that works. But they're essentially one unit to the transport. That's it. They take up all capacity. No duplications or anything like that. It's all sorted. Infantry, however, also includes units on push bikes, units on motorcycles, not motorcycle armored car slots, but actually motorcycle mounted infantry, and cavalry mounted infantry. There's no such. So cavalry is a special rule. It's not a unit type. Motorcycles is a special rule. It's not a unit type. So those models, technically as infantry, can still get in a transport.
And then move even further.
Which, they logic would dictate that is extremely impractical.
However,
there is an argument to be had that some of those interactions could be thought about. Now, some of them also have consequences with doing that. So, for example, push bikes. The moment that you give a push bike a non-run order, you're essentially forcing them to dismount. So if you start them in a transport, and the first thing that transport does is run, you're losing the bikes. You paid the points for nothing. They'll just drop them as they leave. But it's things like that where you're not going to come across those very often. Even with cavalry, which are probably more seen than motorcycles, they're not that frequent. They're good, but maybe on the competitive circuit a bit more. But cavalry can technically still get into a transport, and at no additional transport cost. Because it's weird. Like, the horses just magically evaporate. So I don't know how to explain it. I'm just like, it's like in Infinity War, where everything just dissolves, and it's like, that's all I know what's happening right now. It's like the horse doesn't exist right now.
That is amazing. Because how far can cavalry move on an advance? Because you're already getting 12 inches for the movement of an advance on a truck.
Yeah, so cavalry go 9 on advance and 18 on a run.
Okay. But they could charge on that 18?
No, because you can't charge out of a transport.
Okay, yep, okay.
But I mean, being able to go 12 inches up and then 9 out.
That's pretty cool.
Without a road. Is it's not bad. But you do have problems of if you are at all forced to go down or do any like cavalry does have some restrictions as well where you might suddenly lose them. I don't believe it specifies under cavalry that that they can't get in a transport, which is sort of the thing I was looking for to go. Surely there's a line in here that says may not use a transport, and I'm like, what? I don't see it. Now, why would you bother when your cavalry horse can run further than a truck? But that's a different that's a different conversation. I know. Yeah, it's so if you ran your horses 18 inches, you are technically a couple of inches short than if you'd advanced the truck and got them out with an advance, which is just a cavalry unit of full speed.
That's just going to be so hilarious. Like,
it's another
this little transport. There's nothing there. Don't worry about it, mate. But then just vomit out all the horses.
Vomit out all the horses, and that's I suspect that there is a meme list somewhere of things like this, which it's just bonkers.
Funny thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then, let's say you've covered off all those rules. You think you understand how you're going to deploy and what their purpose is in their list, and even not specific purpose, just you've got something there. And what's the next thing? Well, do you want a soft skin truck or an armored carrier? And this one is, well, in the competitive circuit, it's not hotly debated. Trucks are simply better, and some Jeeps
or simply cheaper
builds.
and move faster.
I said better.
True.
But I do think that there is some.
There is a place.
Yeah, there is some place for armored carriers. It really depends on your playstyle and what you're going for. So when I ran my USA paratroopers, they ran 2 half tracks. Both were veteran. You and I fought actually when in that configuration. You had your early DAC army with all its armored vehicles against my US, and the whole purpose of that list is to just be spitting as much lead as possible in something that doesn't look like it spits a lot of lead. Like everything doesn't necessarily look like it does a lot until I start shooting and focus firing on that list. It works all about on focus firing on the target. And I deliberately took half tracks for that because I only had 8-man squads, 8-man squads of veterans, and I was like, I need to get those 8 men up the field as quickly as possible without any risk of them being further whittled down. And so I deliberately chose a very expensive metal coffin for them to ride in. But I found that majority of the time that was actually perfectly fine. Like there are things that would have shot at those half tracks that if they were trucks they would have disintegrated and evaporated, but simply because they were half tracks and they were veteran half tracks, they kept going.
Pen is now needed.
Yep. And that made a big difference for you're shooting at my half track that's just moved up the field. You put 1 pin on it, the unit inside gets 1 pin. I'm rolling 10s as veteran to get out of that half track and shoot back at you. I'm going to clear that pin and I'm just going to shoot straight back. It's things like that which that actually made much more of a difference than what I thought it would. But I did have to pilot that list extremely well. I had to be on point with my timing because if the half track did fold unexpectedly, a huge component of my list just disappeared. The mobility aspect and typically several of the guys inside. Which hurt the list a lot. But it's what do you want? Do you want something that is lighter but moves faster, or do you want something that is heavier that moves a bit slower but has more versatile options in how it moves? One of the biggest things that I think people overlook between the trucks versus the half-track conversation comes from the fact that movement is doubled on roads. And what I find a lot of new players and even some experienced players getting stuck on is they go, well, roads are the only way to move. That's not true. Half tracks or any tracked transport, they can cross linear obstacles and rough ground. And that's actually one of the reasons that you have to pay so many points for them is because you don't need a road to be mobile. So there are things that you can do that like a truck or a Jeep just simply can't. Like you can go from one side of a hedge to the other where you were out of line of sight and in line of sight, and then the unit's able to get out and shoot at things that they couldn't see a second ago, whereas a truck literally would have to drive all the way around, or find a gap in the hedge somewhere. That means that certain types of ground half-tracks cover significantly better. And it's something which I suspect the reason that isn't given as much weight is because a lot of more competitive boards are typically more open with less linear obstacle rough ground patches, so trucks have or soft skin vehicles
are immediately more useful.
Immediately, because you simply have that mobility element. Whereas if you started putting down patches of rough dirt everywhere, where simply you're funneling those trucks into fire lanes that are now covered with anti-tank weapons, well, that's no use to me. It's like, oh, well, shame. I built a half-track, so I'm just going to do what I want.
I'm going to go around.
And I think that's one of the things that that comes in. Half-tracks
gets
or
overlooked for sure.
Armored carriers also typically come with weapons automatically that can have flak and can drive off aeroplanes, or even just have weapons in general. Now, you pay for those, so it's kind of 6 to 1, half dozen the other in that instance. If you want the gun, you just pay for it on the truck. Now, of course, in the benefit of, and you've said some of these things already, the benefit of soft skins, they're cheap, they're fast, they typically have a smaller or shorter profile. They're not normally as long as what a half-track is. So they're actually, in that extent, they're actually a little bit easier to hide on occasion. They actually can carry, in some cases, more. And depending on the size of your truck, like I know some of the American trucks, like I was reading, I was like, I can carry like 25 dudes in this. Like that's it's like 2.5 squads.
Nuts.
And then I look at my Russian trucks, and I'm there with like I've got maybe 12. Then I look at some of the other ones, and it's like about 10 or whatever. Half tracks typically will sit around that 10 mark, but you can't put anything else really in them. Trucks, you can probably put a unit of 10, maybe a medic, maybe a commander, maybe bit of extra support. So that works in their favour. Penalties, which we'll get into later for doing that, of course. So it's the other one is the straight damage value, and the perceived threat. So damage value is quite simple. One's harder to hurt.
+1 needs a pen to hit it for the most part. Still can pin it. If you
still can pin a lot of them as open topped, but from a damage point of view, you're essentially immune to small arms.
You now need a special weapon.
And then perceived threat range. So, and this is where, again, I think everyone goes, like flamers in a Jeep, or bazooka team in a Jeep, like amazing, so good. They are, like, undoubtedly cheap, effective. Little bit of a one-trick pony, but if their one trick is the only trick they need to do for the whole game, then it's fine, right? Like, it's all good.
Particularly, they go on for a target that's worth way more than they are, including a transport. And if it does its job, then you're gold.
You're straight up. In a point economy, you are just straight up. And I think the big change of how I was viewing the perceived threat is because I don't run my trucks with guns, but my half tracks I do, and that just helps me to use them differently. The perceived threat of essentially a mobile machine gun, just being able to pepper away and not, like if there's a unit nearby to keep it alive, you've essentially just parked a machine gun team, within sort of 18 inches of the enemy. And you don't have to really move after that unless you're threatened, and you can just add in extra shots. Whereas my trucks can't do that, and so without the guns, my trucks typically they're less of a target unless my opponent is chasing a dice to kill. But my trucks essentially can do nothing, and so while they've dropped off a unit, and that's great, they can't support that unit in and of themselves. They don't have any weaponry to do that, and so the armored carriers offer a little bit more of a sustained threat to add to whatever you've dropped off.
Yeah, and especially if you throw the MG on the truck to do the kind of the same role, it's now at risk of being damaged by any small arms. So
yeah, and you're likely to get shot back simply by putting the gun on top. There's a particular American selector, which is I think it's the American Armored Rifle platoon, I think. It's in the D-Day book, and what it allows you to do is essentially have some very efficient half tracks. You get a 10-point discount on the half track. Your heavy machine gun becomes a medium machine gun, and then you essentially take that 10-point discount and purchase for 15 points, but essentially 5 points extra. You purchase another machine gun. So for a small point increase, you double your machine guns on the vehicle, and that can be quite effective. The drawback is you have to actually take one vehicle per infantry unit. So it's not like a tank platoon of simply needing seats. You actually have to buy one extra vehicle per unit. So I wrote up a list and I was like, this is going to be amazing. I've got this many bazooka teams, this many this and this. And then I looked at it and I went, I need 15 half tracks. And so I was like, oh, okay, that's not as good as I thought. Now that's okay. But the point that I was trying to get around to was that even a half track that's able to mount 2 machine guns on it, for the cost of what that's going to be, like if I was doing it with a veteran half track and adding an MG, I'm looking at almost 150 points.
Whereas all your light tanks can do the same thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Yeah.
And they'll have a better.
But
They can't transport, but they'll have a better armor value. So that again goes to what's the purpose. I have a couple of thoughts of how I might do extra MGs and essentially do drifting Tokyo drift drive-bys with machine guns, but there's also a fire arc limitation on those, and I've got to just work through that a little bit more. But that would change their perceived threat of an armored carrier quite significantly, as if you were running multiple MGs on the half tracks and they were running and supporting one another. The ability to put 4 machine guns into anything at 18 inches is not particularly not particularly great from any experience I've had. And if you then drop out 2 units of infantry on top of that and follow it up, it's 4 pins, irrespective of damage. If you're focusing on 1 unit, that's 4 pins immediately. You've just taken that unit out of the game. You've forced their next order to be a rally. And heaven help them if they were out in the open. They are dead. It's just not happening. But I think a lot of people, that perceived threat range is associated with the unit on the inside as opposed to the actual transport, which I kind of get, but armor carriers kind of feel like they have an edge for me there because they come with it by default, even though I'm overpaying. It's,
and then obviously there's the quirky ones. There's a lot of German ones that have different guns, light or like light howitzers, all that kind of stuff, and there's weird things that have medium
lost.
anti-tanks and all that kind of stuff.
I get lost in just how many variants there's. It's like they basically went, we're going to cookie cutter the half track base and make some minor changes every now and then. And literally, it's like they went into the weapons shop. It's like they went into a weapons shop and went, this has to be able to mount onto this, make it work. It's almost any weapon system you want.
As someone who wants to use all the toys, it is a shame that only a fraction of them are available to the transport selectors for the 251s. But there's probably a good reason why.
Probably. There's there are some, and even looking at like the ones that are available, and it's like you basically have whatever you want. Like it's you want something slightly bigger, sure. You want something slightly smaller, sure. You want something really big, sorry. We'll just take the tow version of what you've got and just we'll give it slightly smaller gun. It's like, it's just absolutely. There's a few standouts like the Storm, for example, which is the self-propelled howitzer half-track with storage, like with transport capacity as well.
Yeah.
So you can actually have a squad, support it, and that
is cool.
It makes it a target, but it is very effective. It's very, very effective. So I've already talked a little bit about taking the half tracks as MMG support groups.
And the clear thing here that you'll see most of the time is the Bren carrier stuff.
Yeah. That's it. And that's the Brens come at a great price point. They come with a light machine gun in the hull or an anti-tank rifle, and you can mount another light machine gun on top. And so typically you'll see they'll take the hull mount, they'll take the pintle mount, and then the unit that is inside will come out and will have at least one light machine gun as well.
And facing lists that are full of those can be quite frustrating because all your non-special weapon systems can only pin them.
Yeah, that's it. And you're probably looking like, if your opponent only has, for example, 2 of those units in any combination, that's very reasonable to deal with.
Yeah.
That's fine. And even 3, you can have a couple of lucky shots and get up on top of that really quickly. When it's 4 or potentially 5, that becomes a lot harder to deal with. Simply the number of shots on individual units coming back at you starts to take its toll, especially because they also focus fire. The M3 Scout car is similar, where it's only I think it's a 5-man unit that can go in it, but it can have, I think it's up to 3 machine guns attached to it, and so that thing is, they don't all shoot in the same fire arc, but you just drive them all forward and just shoot out whichever way you want, because the base price of getting an M3 carrier car is actually not that expensive.
All that much.
So you just pay for the machine guns. Gets a bit worse when you put the special mounted recon unit in them as well, that allows them to essentially disengage and then fire those 3 machine guns for the rest of the game. But whatever, it is what it is. They do. But those medium machine gun support vehicles, you operate very differently to how you would do just a simple what my trucks typically do, which is rush forward, disgorge their troops, and then nick off and hide their dice. So a different way to use those sorts of transports. What do you reckon? Is it new player friendly to use them in that way as more like mobile machine gun platforms?
I mean, it sounds like it is because it's forgiving.
Is it though?
Okay, it's forgiving because you have a purpose. You have a dual purpose vehicle straight away. So you do its transport. Maybe you do its maybe you don't. Whatever. Now you have a vehicle that can shoot. So that's forgiving in that perspective. You're paying for it for sure in the list. And that's the key thing that I've found when being a new player trying to use that kind of stuff. But I think in my head, as a more of experienced player, that the part of using a regular transport and it vomiting out its troops, and then what do you do with it? I'm like, maybe it is actually worth spending this money to actually make it a bit more of a threat and useful post transport.
Yeah. And that's similar to what I came to, I think, with my conclusion is adding extra machine guns so you're ready to be able to just stack on pins the following turn. That's where I think there's some value. I'm yet to test that out to really understand whether that's true, because the risk in
the empty transport.
The empty transport, The risk inherent with all of these is that if you have an empty transport closer to an enemy unit at the end of the turn than a friendly unit, it auto dies, and in those cases, it's actually fully removed from the table, so you don't even get the benefit of it becoming a wreck.
And this is known by everybody. So you will see that. I'm not going to destroy that. I'm just going to run to it. You know what I mean? So,
Yep, absolutely. because sometimes you want the cover to either take advantage of yourself, or you're not in a position to run towards it, and so you're actually just going to take the shot. But a lot of the times when you're in the position and all you have to do is move,
why not?
Oh, excuse me. Why not? Because you're going to pick it up. It's going to be a dice that your opponent's not getting next turn, and you can actually shoot. You can happily shoot something else.
Yeah. Look, I'd be willing to take that as a learning opportunity over a couple of games to learn the placement to not get them in those situations. But
I'd almost say that you have to go through that process where it will happen, where you're going to get outmaneuvered, either on purpose or by accident. But it happens to me now, right? Where I get outmaneuvered and some dice don't go the way I expected to from their statistical averages, and as a result, my transport goes by, and it just goes. That was a fun game. I'm going back in the box. And you just have to, in circumstances like that, you just have to take the good with the bad, and you're here to play a game. Your transports will, on occasion, get caught out, and they'll be surrendered off to the enemy, and they'll just be taken off the board.
More likely.
Yeah. So we touched on a couple of these pieces earlier, but we might just go into talking about a bit more detail. So obviously one of the biggest benefits of a transport is your ability to mobilize and actually move a unit quickly from one location to another. So on the podcast, when we talk about a unit's threat range, we typically talk about the footprint of the board that it has influence on, that it controls. So people with rifles, 24 is your maximum influence range, but realistically it's a 12-inch marker around them that they're going to have the most contention and the most, the most control within the sphere of the game. Like if you got 10 guys sitting on cover on an objective and you're sending another 10 guys after them, they need a serious effort to actually push them off that 12-inch mark. So getting up to that 12 inches is not a problem, but to shift them off and for you to run in typically takes a bit more effort. So all of those different threat ranges for your units, with the exception maybe of artillery, are increased by having a transport in partnership with them, where they pull them up the field. Artillery is only different because you actually have to give up 2 turns of their threat range. So because you got to, even if they start loaded up, it's going to take probably a turn to get into position of where you want, if you know where the assets are. Then you've got to get out, but you have to get out with a run order, so you can't fire that turn. Then the next turn, if you survived, then you can shoot. So also a reason why you don't see many people tow artillery pieces, because it's negligible value. You're losing shots that you really can't afford to lose. But yeah, things like flamers, where you go, 6-inch range, that's horrible. To put in a Jeep.
Now
24-inch run, ready for next turn, you're done. It's like even bazookas, Panzerschrecks, both classics to go in a light transport. I've done it, as I said earlier, I did it with light mortars, where light mortars were in a half track, and so I would advance sort of 9 or 12, depending on where I was with a truck or a half track. And then I would get out 6, and then I'd bomb 24 away, and that was, I could basically hit the back edge of the board in those circumstances.
And
like
unexpected if someone has run into it.
Well, and with Japanese having 3 light mortars, I put a few more than 3 though. The big load up of squads versus the singles. What's your thoughts?
So, are we talking heavy transport that has lots of capacity that could have multiple squads in it? Is that what we're talking about?
A little bit. So that's definitely that probably talks to the last point on my agenda that I had put down.
Right.
Yep. But what I'm talking about is even a truck. If you have a unit of, say, 6 riflemen or 6 commandos with SMGs, you have 4 spaces left typically in that truck. You can put 2 teams. You could put a Piat team and a maybe a light mortar team in that
Yep.
truck. And so you end up with 6 commandos, light mortar, and a Piet team.
Yep.
Let's just say Piet teams are okay and good for this instance.
Do you?
Do you see benefit in being able to do that as opposed to just take, and not from a point value of just taking 10 commandos, but simply, would you rather risk only one unit in that transport, or would you prefer to have multiple, which extends your options a little bit?
Yeah, I'm the fan of one unit, one transport, and the transport capacity being tailored to the unit that's in it. So that there's actually a fair amount of trucks that have all varying sizes of transport capacity. So I pick precisely what I need for the unit that's going to be in there, and I think that's point sufficient, but I think it's more that's also activation efficient as well. It's quite a bit of risk to a transport being in there with multiple units in it, rather than just the one that's going to do its one task and then move on. And yeah, it goes back to where I'm talking about the rushes and all that kind of stuff. I like to have my 2-man teams in little jeeps and all that kind of stuff doing their own thing. It's a slightly more expensive, but I think it's safer. That's just my opinion.
No, and I think
I feel more comfortable that way. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think for all new players who are getting started, that should be where they start.
Yeah.
And for a lot of them, they will actually go, yep, this is comfortable, this is achievable, I'm happy with it. I don't have to do anything else.
Having where we at, we're talking about multiple units in a transport, and why I'm wrong.
Yep. Well, not wrong. So I would agree with you that when it comes to one unit in one transport feels like the right number. It feels like that you're risking just enough, but also there's a good payoff afterwards, and you're okay. There are some very rare exceptions that I think are tied to how you want to play a particular mission or a particular terrain setup, where doing multiple units in one transport makes more sense. So especially if you're trying to hide from something like prep bombardment, it makes a lot of sense to put everything in one transport and just reduce the number of dice that are being rolled against you. If you're a multi-launcher, for example, it's actually a great defense against a multi-launcher, especially if you can get it out of line of sight and just simply force your whole army to disappear. The other one is anything like double envelopment, or what's the other one that you have to run off the table for, where you get points
multi-units off the end. Yeah.
If you're playing a mission like that, it totally makes sense to forget shooting them and just make, like, they're more valuable running off the table than anything they're going to kill. So just run those teams off the table and just pick the safest path that transport can go and just gun it and just get it across. You won't miss them. So I think those make sense, but they're, like I said, they're much more specific. They're not if they're not the general application of a transport. And then we get into like what you were leading into the first time, which is things like the land schlepper, things like the buffalo, the LVT buffalo, the monstrous, like we can hold 30 troops in us and go in water and do all these other things. It's like, but I move 6 a turn and I don't really have a great armor. I don't really have like, there's all these other things that go with it, but those big units that basically can carry almost a whole section and platoon onto themselves. A section, of course, being 10 men. You're right; it should be a platoon. Those things actually have massive value when in outflank. Huge, because you can simply take what is a large component of your staying power and deliver it on the left or the right quite comfortably. Most of the time, those really big ones are not fast. They're quite restricted and super big, and so you're going to be seeing by virtually everything.
Yeah. Which makes outflank or reserve the smart play.
Because you can protect it to get it up. And if you look at 3 turns worth of movement, for example, for like the buffalo, depending on the terrain, you might only make 18 inches, right? Like, you know, because unless you position and get really good for a run, and then you can maybe get some movement out of that. But even if you did that, you're still turn 3, you're coming on and able to hit the same ground, but in a much more direct route. And so it's like, well, outflank is really the way to go for that.
Yep.
Though, because if they are on the board and they get taken out, the potential is it's bad. I mean, I've done it where I've put multiple units in a transport with the intent to try and run them off the board in some way, shape, or form, and they get taken out. And everything inside dies. It's just, you give up sort of 3 or 4 dice and victory points all at one time, and it doesn't feel good. But that's the trade-off. You gotta understand what the trade-off is. So if you take the water buffalo, and this actually goes into one of the bottom reasons that we've got there. There's a concept known as the Russian doll, and exploiting the Russian doll. I think Gorchin was the one that came up with the worst example that I've heard of. But or clown car, as it's sometimes known as well.
Sure.
You take lots of things coming out of something very, something unpredictable or small. The Landstrapper and the Buffalo are not exactly small, and so you expect a lot to come out of them. But there are a few quirky transports that allow you to do things that aren't necessarily kosher. I'm not sure. I'm still not sure how I feel about Gorchin's example. But there's one that allows you to apparently put like an armored car transport in it, which is then allowed to carry something in it. So you have it move up, kick something out, and then a unit kick up out of that. And it's just like, I'm not sure I like that. But yeah, the most transports are going to disgorge probably 8 to 10 guys on any given expectation of a limit. But when you have a big or a transport that's somehow able to get more than 10 guys suddenly drop down, in certain spaces, that can actually be quite a lot of pressure. And that can be quite... You're exploiting the fact that you can simply drop down more than 10 guys at one time. Like if you imagine, Mike Andrews' list, if we'd played again and he put that on one of my flanks, for example, and 25 guys and a commander jumped out of it, in my flank, I'm like, just not much I can. No.
Yeah.
I can't deal with that because my army's busy over there firing a whole bunch of other light mortars and stuff. It's like they're not turning around to face this. It's like I don't really have an answer. And it's that sort of an impact that you're going for. Is like you're not just arriving on a flank to try and cause impact. You're arriving on a flank and saying, "This is mine now. Go away." And I think there's one other main thing to consider with transports that we haven't really touched on, the reason as why you would do it. We've done it from a machine gun point of view, but we haven't really done it for anything else. You might have mentioned it briefly, but that's the point around making sure that you have redundancy with your transports. So the concept is that if 1 is good, 2 is better, and 3 is best. Right? So
simple.
if 1 is good, then 2 of good must be better. And then if you have 3 of something, which is where you've come to, right? You're starting to turn around to go, I want more. 3 is best. Anything more than 3, and ironically, unless you're exploiting, for example, the MMG capacity like the Brens, LMGs like the Brens or MMGs, anything more than 3, you almost start seeing diminishing returns. Partly because your points run out, and so you can't spend it on anything else. Or the roles that those transports need to do you simply create traffic jams by having
Yeah.
more than sort of 3 units that are focused on doing it. So my sweet spot typically is 2. I'll
Yep.
normally run 2 transports of some description, normally the same, so either both soft skin or both armored.
Yeah.
And I will run them, with the point of they're both going to try and drive the same way, unless I'm playing
Yeah.
something like envelopment, and then I'm just going to stack them both up and force you to choose a left or a right. Sometimes my opponent chooses both and just deletes them.
Yeah.
But then there's lists like the diminishing returns I saw when I was playtesting my Japanese hokey pokey list that I wrote, which was basically units of 13 riflemen in tracked carriers with a commander I think it was a commander on a horse that just rode behind them. And there's a couple of MG cars and stuff that were in there, but essentially it was, I'm going to run and put 33 guys point blank in your face and then just charge you next turn. You can't kill 33 in one turn normally off a single squad. I'm just going to steamroll it.
Too bad.
And there were 6 of those units, and so it was like this wave of just Japanese riflemen out of carriers, and you were going to get given essentially 1 turn to deal with them before they were in your face. And I was like, against some list, like a fully armored list, you're laughing because I can't actually hurt you. It's like I can't do anything. But for anything that involved objective taking or infantry, it was like There's like
That's
84 Japanese riflemen, man. Like
good luck.
Yeah, it's when you include all the other like special teams that I had with it and stuff, it was like it's 84 guys and they're fanatic, so they don't fold easily. It's not like an inexperienced set of 84 guys. It's like these are 84 regular dudes that just 840 points worth of rifles.
Yeah, that's significant.
Yeah, I mean it's sort of the Hokies, because they're track carriers. Like this almost the sort of a Bren carrier space, but with less guns, and they just hold 13 dudes. And I was like, how many of those can I have?
This many.
It's a lot. But you do get diminishing returns because you have to make that sacrifice of other things. Like I had no anti-tank threat in my list whatsoever, so any tank was going to just cause problems for me. Outside of blocking it and like locking it in 6 carriers that had died, I didn't really have an option.
Not even your suicide boys.
I don't think they were in the list in the original
They're
version
so
that I wrote.
Cheap.
yeah, I don't think they were in there.
You probably thought they needed transporters to keep up with the rest.
really fit Japanese suicide bombers. Yeah, I think because the overall gist of transports, so do I recommend everybody plays with them? No. But I do think that if you enjoy having some mobility in your list, if you like to be able to counterattack, if you like to be able to sort of like take a bit of damage and push back, transports are really good for that purpose. Really, really good for that purpose. If you are interested in being able to strike really hard and fast and try and cripple your opponent so that they can't strike back effectively, transports are really good for that. If you're looking to deal a killer blow that your opponent can't recover from but a little bit later in the game, transports are really good for that, because of what they allow you to put those units in the right places. It's not the only requirements or how to play for bolt action. Like transports are not mandatory to take, but they do give you a lot of flexibility in how you want to play the game. And this is the part that I'm still learning because I haven't quite cottoned on yet, is how best to defend a transport. So not just positioning on the terrain, but what else do I put in my list so that my transports are actually not target number 1? Because typically at the moment, what happens is I'll line up. Even the game I had against Chris Ramsey last Sunday, just gone, and even though we only got a couple of turns into that game, he was trying his hardest to shoot at the transports for where he could see them, in preference because he knew that those transports being mobile and being able to run around and drop 20 Bulgarian troops basically anywhere I wanted was a problem. And I didn't have anything else in my list that I'd made visible to him that was a more worthwhile target. Yeah. So by doing that, what I actually did was I made his choices easier because everything that possibly could simply shot at the transports. That's a learning curve that takes a lot longer because that depends on terrain, mission, opponent, your experience with the game, and also the part you can't control, which is what your opponent chooses to shoot at.
That too, but I mean, also the aggressiveness of transports and being in their side of the board with nothing else that they could actually even get in range of, so it is a bit of a risky play. I mean, I think that the default thing for people to start with is just to start putting their two-man teams in jeeps and playing around with that and getting comfortable with that. I think that's where you should start. I think trying the reserve outflank transport NG, particularly for missions that you need to capture or defeat or a point in their deployment zone, whatever else. I think that's where people should also get familiar with. If you want to do the rushes like me, then you're going to need more than one transport. Two is better. 3 is best.
That's it.
But there's quite a lot covered here. Bo does some good stuff on it as well. Yes. But do have some careful consideration around, do we include machine guns? Do we go armored? Make them more suitable for another job post-transporting? Obviously, and then the movement. I mean, our boards are typically all rough and all that kind of stuff, so it makes sense for a half-track. It actually...
Yes. Half-tracks actually perform quite well in our meta. But look, as we always say on this podcast, the best thing that you can do is simply just play games and get some good people and players around from our local community and hey, I want to test out using transports. Most of them are going to be like, sweet, let's walk that through, and we won't tell you how to do it. We'll let you sort of work through and figure it out, but you ask questions. If we see that you're struggling with a decision or we think we know what it is, typically the players will go, are you thinking about doing this? Because you probably should do that. Or they'll go, don't waste your time, do it over here, look at it from this angle. The community is really good at helping you do that sort of stuff when you're getting started, or even if you're experienced and wanting to try something new. I know, like for a long time, I didn't use transports. I was like, I don't need transports. I'm just going to spend the extra points elsewhere, and I'm just going to do everything on foot. Yeah. And that's a perfectly acceptable way to play. I had quite a lot of success learning how to use troops that way. But I do feel that the options open up when you allow when you start to learn how to use a transport. Just gives you more tools in your toolkit.
100%. I mean, and it's about making an exploit in their line, which you just can't do if you don't have the mobility for it, because your whole force is moving at the same rate.
Yes.
So that gap is just gonna disappear on you. So it is risky, but it is high risk, high reward. I think it's a key part of playing this game. So you should become familiar with them. And if you're not having all that much success with transports, let us know. Maybe describe some of your games in the comments. Maybe we can give you some pointers from there. But I think you're only going to learn through your mistakes as it is anyway. That's how we all learn at playing this game as it is. So
and still learning.
Don't be afraid. Try some new stuff. That was a really good chat on transports, Dan. I guess we will catch you guys next time on the next episode. Thanks for checking in for HMG. This is Western Tabletop. You can find us on Spotify, YouTube, all that kind of stuff. Wherever you're watching this right now and everywhere else on the internet, we're there. Do let us know if this is another topic that you enjoy. Again, not too much event focus. This is more tactics. If this is what you like, do let us know if there's something that we haven't covered. We'll go through it. And we'll go from
absolutely.
There.
And check out. Really take the time to check out Bo's channel with his because his transport video in particular is
It's
really
his
good.
best. I would say it's his best and most comprehensive video that he has. And again, I watch it before an event if I'm using transports. It's that good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cheers, guys. We'll see you
Cool.
next time. I'm Jacob. You are.
I'm Dan.
You are Dan.
I
Cool.
am Dan.
All right.
I'm still Dan.
We'll catch you next time.